Started. We have somebody on the screen also who we're going to pop up.
We will get this sorted out.
We're going to get this sorted up.
Please present.
So the first session today, session 8, is Free and Liberated Africans. Do we want to do all the papers at once, or are we going to do a paper and then questions? Paper and then questions. We'll do the paper and then question thing. Is that okay? So the first paper, Martha Ladley from OCAD and Katrina Keefer from Trent University. She's on the screen. I can't read any of this. Goodness. Yeah, there we go. It's my eyes, actually. Chadha from OCAD as well will be presenting on the Language of Marks, a web portal for transatlantic slave trade data collection, visualization, and transcription. So take it away. You have 12 minutes.
And thank you so much, everyone, for having me. I piped in from Canada. I regret that I can't be here. My back is completely out, so I couldn't handle the drive. I'd like to get into it then. I was able to watch the live stream yesterday, and it looked like a really fantastic conference, and it is. And I'm going to start with my PowerPoint, and I'd like to speak about the language of marks. So this is a project that we've been working on for some time now. And Albert yesterday spoke a lot about body markings, and that was a real treat to get a chance to listen to him speaking about that. And the ideas of how we construct Africanness and how the recording of body markings serves to reinforce meta-narratives and power relations. I'd like to speak in the time that I've got. Firstly, I would like to speak about the theoretical side of this. So what's the point of marking is really one of the fundamental underpinnings of what our project concerns. Marking is fundamentally a method of acculturation. It serves to situate an individual within his or her broader community. It's an act which anthropologists have described as being a fundamental method of creating a human body. Humans are, to our knowledge, the only mammals that cheerfully mark, modify, or alter our bodies on a permanent basis, and it is certainly a method by which we largely reinforce how we see ourselves within our communities. Now, in the context of the African continent, what's extremely important about marking is that marking situates not only the individual within the group, but it also serves to place and represent family and kin group connections. So anyone who's familiar with marking will know that you can largely recognize somebody based on their marks. You can begin to situate them as this person who belongs to Hausa, as this person who's Yoruba, as this person Mende. Depending on where they're from and depending on what you can read an awful lot. Moreover, markings also serve to represent personal achievements. They represent subgroup membership, as in the case of the Poro Society of the Upper Guinea Coast. Markings there represent your membership within Poro. So these are methods of reading marks, which allow us to begin to delve into how an individual is situated within their broader community and their broader context. And moreover, this means that using these anthropological theories, to a large degree, we can also position individuals and individual humans within what they ought to be, within how they see themselves, within their origins or within their situational context. So how do we read them? Well, there's a few ways that we can read them. One of the most interesting to my mind is the fact that you can broadly begin to categorize marks within large geographic regions, just based on the traditions of body markings within those regions. What I've noticed is, and I'm going to use a little bit of medical terminology briefly, that marks are atrophic. An atrophic mark is a mark which, if you've been cut, it's healed in a way that is indented. So the scar tissue has actually left almost like a little valley. There's also hypertrophic marks where the collagen that's been produced has actually extended and extended above, so you have something almost like a bump or a lump. Colloidal, which is where the collagen has actually kind of gone a bit haywire, it's expanded beyond the original boundaries of the wound, and inked, which I use to incorporate to understand marks which are usually incorporated there's broad regions where these tend to be the case and where certain types of marks tend to be more prevalent. In terms of what we have that represents this material, we have an awful lot, as we've been hearing. There's so much stuff. And if you can read even just the broadest types of marks, you can begin to start to understand where an individual may possibly come from. And I'm using lots of cautious wording here because it is difficult to be exact. So for example, we have from the Liberated Africans Register of 1814, 1815. We have an example here where you can see what certainly appear to be atrophic scars. They've been drawn quite nicely here. In this example, which I have to thank Manuel Garcia for drawing to my attention, we see an individual who is claimed to be born in Havana, but I find that doubtful given the fact that his markings certainly don't represent anything that I've seen in that context. He's called tattooed here, and this is something that is a bit of a challenge. There's often a conflation between the word tattoo and the word scar, so that can be challenging. Within the Armitage text from 1924, we can see what certainly appear to be atrophic marks. So how do we do this? I'm going to walk us through very briefly an analog method for doing this, and then I'm going to turn things over to my colleague Kartikay, who's been working on the OCAD side of things, who are really employing the digital workhorses and muscle to make this happen. So in an analog sense, here's how we try and do this. So here's an individual from the Registers of Liberated Africans. He's recapped of 5959. And what we can see here in the original image is that he has this mark each side eye. So the first things I can tell you about him, I've got him represented here in an artistic template that I've generated. I can tell you he has an atrophic scar pattern. I can tell you that it seems to be a West African pattern, and it's situated around his eye corners. He does not have any additional marks that are mentioned or represented anywhere else on his face. Now, upon some careful examination, if you look to Pierre Donnet, you can see that this actually seems to be a Hausa mark. And I'm very grateful to Paul Lovejoy for translation because I'm not fluent in Hausa. But yes, this is a Hausa mark. So if you're a little skeptical and you think, well, wait, okay, that's one source. But we also have this, which is from Zinder, similar. It's not necessarily exact, but then we have this, which comes from Abubakar Babajo Sami's work. And interestingly enough, it's from roughly the same region. So I think we can at this point largely conclude that this individual Kando is most likely Hausa. He is likely from the region which is bounded by Tasawa, is no further south than Katsina. So we can really begin to position this individual and his origin based on his marking. So this is kind of where we're going. This is what we're trying to do. And not to downplay it, there's an awful lot of work that needs to be done. In terms of simply defining who's got scars, what the scars are, we can look at it just as a broad idea. If every scar, potentially, if we have a whole lot of scars per ethno-linguistic group, we have challenges there. So we're looking at an enormous amount of effort if we do this by one person at a time, or the analog approach that I've discussed, which is where we need to shift over to issues like machine learning, neural networks, and facial recognition algorithms. And for that, I would like to pass the mic, so to speak, over to my colleague, Kartikay.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that introduction, Katrina. And let's have this move up soon.
It'll come up in a second, usually.
Okay.
There's a little delay. If it doesn't, Jeff will help us. There we go.
Perfect. All right, so I am actually going to power through this presentation in the interest of time. My name is Kartikay Chadha, and I'm the project manager and research assistant at the OCAD University. Sorry, this is not the exact slide. And, okay, meanwhile this is working, I will keep on talking about things. So, Katrina contacted our team, and my supervisor is Dr. Martha Ladley, who's not here, unfortunately, because she had some family engagement and she couldn't be here. But Katrina approached us, and she came up with these questions and these challenges, and we decided to bring in computer science in here. We run a very multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary team at OCAD University that include designers, artists, bioinformaticians like myself, data analysis, big data visualization experts. And we are trying to basically do 3 different things. The first thing is that we are trying to see how we can collect, organize, transcribe this data, because this was the first challenge that we saw when we got into the field very recently, that people are working and it's very challenging in terms of working with the Excel sheets, and then you have the images. So that was the first challenge that we came across. Also, there's a lot of repetitive work that is happening, so we want to bring everybody together and see how that work can go forward. And that's the first challenge that we are trying to work with. The second thing is that we want to see different way of visualizing this data, and using avatars, using 3D modeling, and different kinds of data visualization techniques. And the third thing that Katrina has talked about is that we want to look into artificial neural networks and machine learning to cross-reference these body marks. So exactly the analog method that she told, we're trying to see how we can bring in computers to do this. One important thing that I would like to mention here is that we are trying to use narrative methodology, basically creating events of individuals' lives pertain to living bodies. So therefore, I would like to make this statement here that we need to be very careful when we call this data. They're people. It's more important that we recognize that thing, and even if from the computer science point of view, I completely understand, we love data and we like talking about data, but these are people, and we need to be really careful about it. We need to be very respectful of this data and of this information. We divided this project into 3 different phases, and we are right now in the first phase. These are different challenges that we are facing right now. I will go through really quickly through them. The first one is the data collection that I was talking about. And to solve that problem, we come up with this portal, which is the language of marks web portal, where you can actually collaborate, do transcriptions, you can upload the images, and you can get all the metadata tagged, and the computer itself tags all the images with the metadata. We identified 80 records between 1814 and 1815 right now that have marks entries, and we are trying to work with them. So this is like our pilot phase, so we are trying to work with this as a prototype. This is the screenshot of the portal, and so we also use user-centered design and iterative methodologies. So basically, we're trying to work with historians. We're working with Henry and Paul and all these teams, and we're trying to see what is needed and what we can bring in there. So this was the first design that we came up with. There were a lot of conversation, and then we are right now rebuilding it with a different design, making it more closer to what things you want. So that is one of the major things that we are trying to work with. Other things that we're working on, our team was in Freetown 2 weeks ago. We are trying to set a visualization and data transfer protocol there. There are a lot of issues that I was there, and we came up with different challenges in terms of electricity, internet. So we were able to set up an internet connection over there, and we are trying to make a protocol so that the data can be digitalized and can be sent over the internet to us. And also, another challenge is the transcription of these documents. So people are working and doing manual transcriptions. We are trying to set a protocol where we pass these images through Photoshop, and then we are able to recognize the text on these images. So it'll be very easy to go through them. You will not have to type anything in there. So that's one of the things. And I'm running almost out of time, and I'm almost there. So I would like to acknowledge all my team and all our fundings organization, OCAD University, especially my principal investigator on this project, Katrina Keefer. Mike is sitting right over here. He is an amazing RA and has been helping me out and all the team out. So thank you very much. And that's my contact detail. I know it was very powering through. So if you have any questions or anything, we can have a chat afterwards. So thank you very much.
Questions about the project? Can we pull Katrina back up on the screen?
I am just doing that.
Okay. First question, up in the behind David.
It's about Native Americans. Body marking is not always about identity. Oftentimes it's about life events like heroism in battle or having been captured or cross-cuts identity. I was curious not to hear any oral hints.
Can Kartikay repeat things?
I'll repeat.
You know what?
Fantastic.
At least among Native Americans, body marking is not always about identity. Often it's about life events like heroism in battle or having been captured. And these marks sometimes cross-cut the identities of groups. And I'm just curious if y'all had done any oral histories in Africa to elicit the variety of meanings that may be attached to some of these body marks.
Can you repeat that? The audio is a little tricky here.
That's not piping to her. Oh, it's not. The question had to do with the meaning of body marks and, yeah?
That transcend identity.
That transcend identity.
Other meanings attached.
Is she hearing through here?
So
Okay.
we're referring to wounds in that case?
No, can you hear me now?
No. I think it's through this.
No, it is through the computer.
Oh, it's through the computer.
Yes.
I don't know how to repeat the question.
Scarification to identify life events.
Scarification to identify life events.
Not cultural affiliation.
Okay. I can do that. I can
Okay.
talk to that. Okay, so scarification to identify life events. I think one of the ones that I'm most familiar with would be initiation into the Poro Society. So there's scarification which transcends what we might call ethnicity, and there's scarification which refers to things such as giving birth to a child, to success in war, to membership within, again, like initiation societies such as Poro. And what we can understand with that kind of scarification, if I look at someone who's wearing Poro scars, then there's a few things you can draw out of that immediately. One, they're from the Upper Guinea Coast. That's a pretty fast, easy thing to identify. That means that they're from one of the groups of people which largely practice Poro on the Upper Guinea Coast. So now we have a narrowed down region with which to begin to start to identify more closely. And most people who have Poro marks often have, or they tend to have additional marks. So they may have Mende marks, they may have Lumba marks, they may have a lot of different other marks, which can help us to narrow it down that much further. But even at the very least, if we know someone has Poro marks, then we know the rough geographic region from which they're coming.
David Eltis has a question.
I noticed that you're focusing on the period 1809 to 1819. It's a couple of years since we worked on this stuff, our group, but it seems to me the most dramatic and detailed descriptions of these body markings actually come from the later period in the registers. I think I could give you the exact dates. I don't have them at hand, but I think it's in the 1830s. So do you have any recollection of that? Which year? In any event, I remember a very strong difference. It covers maybe just a few hundred cases, but it's extremely detailed. And much better than I think the period that you studied or seem to be focusing on.
So David Eltis says that his recollection of the records, his knowledge of the records, is that the particular time period that you focused on here, there are probably not that many descriptions of body markings, but for some of the later periods, there are much richer descriptions of body markings.
I would say that it's very touch and go in terms of certain registers from the period I find, from the period of the Court of Mixed Commission within the Registers of Liberated Africans, there tends to be a much more random quality to which ones have scarification detailed. More often than not, you'll find it'll simply say marked, no marks, marks, no marks, or something of that nature, which is not particularly helpful for what we're working on. During the period of the Court of the Vice Admiralty Court, we found a remarkably rich number, not just of described marks, but detailed described marks, and moreover, drawn described marks. So between the periods of 1808 through 1819, there actually seems to be a very high prevalence of these, comparatively speaking. There are certainly examples from the later period where there's very rich detail and evidence, but it seems to be very much dependent on whether or not the clerk at the time had the skill or the interest to record what they were seeing. It seems much more common in the earlier period that they were largely involved, or at least inclined to report things.
Daryl, question.
So to continue that, you're going to get us out of the Atlantic and the Brazilian case here.
So Daryl has added to David's point, saying that other time periods and other sources of records would certainly allow you to expand the geographical and temporal scope of what you're doing.
And I completely agree with him. I think that that's one of the things I think that we need to emphasize about our project is that right now it's a proof of concept. We're applying a known data set. The intention is to continue to add data sets. The intention is to really mine all of these many rich, wonderful, varied sources that exist throughout the Atlantic world and generated from multiple countries. And so to a large degree, that's where we need other people's help, who are more familiar with layer of different data sets and are happy to help plug them in. As we can begin to get sort of critical mass with the neural network, that's also going to improve the quality of our results. So the more data we have about individuals, as Kartikay rightly reminds us, the more we have, the more we can get.
Okay, one last question right here.
A question from the end of translated. Have you studied local practices in the use of plants to enhance or act as an antidote when the markings are created, when the scarification is done? So have you studied the use of plants in relationship to the markings?
So the question is, have you studied the use of plants in local contexts in the use, well, as used in the scarification processes in various places?
That's a great question. That's not something that we've currently implemented into the project, but it is something I'm aware of. I would certainly direct people who are interested to look into the work of Lars Kruczek and other anthropologists who've looked into types of thorn bushes, for example, which are used to better enhance hypertrophic scars, commonly, and at least more commonly within Central Africa. So it's definitely something that I'm thinking about. It's a little bit harder to mine the archival data and the drawings that we've got and the descriptions that we've got for it, but it's something I'm definitely aware of and find very interesting.
Okay, well, thank you, Katrina, and the OCAD team. Thank you, Katrina. And next, we have Philip Misevich from St. John's University, who's going to speak about the African Origins database as soon as we get
What's the best?
the microphone on him.
Sure. I do not remember which presentation is yours.
Misevich down here. And if you wouldn't mind just blowing it up, because I use Macs most of the time.
So we need to actually do presentation mode.
Maybe this is down here, right? One of these. And I just use the arrows here. Okay. All right. Well, thank you. Let me first say it's always amazing to be in the midst of such cutting-edge research. I'm always amazed by the number, the depth, and the breadth of projects that people are involved in. And I'm going to show off today the African Origins database, which is, at least comparatively speaking, a mature project compared to other ones that we've been introduced to. It's been around for about 10 years, and I've been working with a big team of scholars on this. So I was originally thinking I would bring up the database live, but someone once warned me with presentations to never go live with animals or websites. And so then I realized that I didn't include the URL for the site, which if you're on your laptops, you should feel free to bring up. It's www.african-origins.org. And this is a project that attempts to use particularly names of liberated Africans, that is Africans who were freed from slave ships in the 19th century, to try and better understand the likely identities, origins, and homelands of people who were caught up in the final phase of the slave trade. So, as this makes clear, I want to say the previous group, I knew they would when I looked at the program, but they took some of my slides. So I'll go through this kind of quickly, but as this implies, the data for this project are based on British efforts in the 19th century to try to suppress the transatlantic slave trade. As many people in this room will know, During the period beginning in 1808 and proceeding on, particularly beginning in 1819 and through the rest of the 19th century, the British dedicated naval resources to try and forcibly suppress the transatlantic slave trade based on treaties that Britain had signed with rival European powers. They enforced these treaties by sending their naval vessels off the coast of West Africa and to a lesser degree in the Caribbean, where they seized slave ships and brought them to courts that had been established at various sites around the Atlantic world, particularly for this project in Freetown for those vessels that were captured off the coast of West Africa, and in the Americas, Havana and Rio. So what this project tries to do, and this is where my slide was taken, and they used a better quality one than me, but this is the registers of liberated Africans. This is the key to this entire project. In each case where the British captured a vessel that was operating illegally based on the treaties they had signed, when the vessel was condemned, the British kept these ledgers that included personal details about each African who was liberated off of the slave ship. The scale of this data is intense. For our database, it includes 91,491 individuals. And whereas the previous project uses the descriptions of scarification, we focus in on names. And the key to this is that we know not just the indigenous African name, but we know the port in Africa on which captives had been loaded onto slave ships. And it's those two bits of information combined that we think offers a rich opportunity to better understand captives themselves in the context of Africa. So what did we do? This original data, I think since the 80s or 90s, had been in a spreadsheet, and when the Voyages project launched, it was included under the very popular African names database where it still is. But in that site, they merely list the data and allow you to search through it. The Origin site is an effort for users who are familiar with African names to contribute. The basic premise is this. For a captive who was loaded on board a slave ship along the coast in Lagos or along the coast of what today would be Nigeria, lots of people recognize names in these registers as belonging to particular ethno-linguistic groups. Not all of them do, but lots of them do. And the point is that, based on reading these data, individuals can click on a name and they can contribute what they think is the likely ethno-linguistic affiliation to that name. So we have data that ranges the coast of West Africa. It's most heavily concentrated along the coast of what today would be Nigeria, where about half of the 92,000 individuals listed in this site were put on board slave ships. And over time, what we're hoping is that more and more people will contribute to this in an effort to better understand the backgrounds of people who were forced on board slave ships. Now, the data, I should add, is complex for all sorts of reasons. And this provides a real challenge for the site. One thing that makes it complex is that it wasn't Africans who wrote the names down. Africans who were liberated off of slave ships appeared before clerks in the court. They wrote they spoke their names, and often with the help of another liberated African, they had them recorded. In the case of Freetown, it was British colonial officials who wrote down the information. For individuals who were liberated across the ocean and who were processed through the courts in Havana, it was a Cuban official using Spanish spelling conventions to write the name. So sometimes you can have the exact same name, one written the way someone who speaks Spanish in Cuba would have written it, the other written by the way someone in 19th century Britain would have done it. How do we get around that? Well, if you see this little triangle on the side here, what we've done, and God bless them, people had gone through all 92,000 of these names, and we had a British person pronounce all of the names that were written down by a British clerk in Freetown, and we had a Cuban person pronounce all of the ones that were recorded in Havana using Spanish spelling conventions. So we encourage visitors to the site to actually click on the pronunciation, because often the transcribed name, if you just read it, isn't quite the same as when you pronounce it. So the idea is that we work backwards from the way the record was generated, understanding the spelling conventions that would have been used at the time. It's been a relatively successful project so far. So as I said before, we're about 10 years into the project. At this point, we've been working with lots of people. Some contributions come from scholars who use the data. So in my case, I used it for my research for my book on Sierra Leone in the 19th century, using about 8,000 names of recaptives, liberated Africans who came from the Galinas area, about 200 miles south of Freetown. But often we get contributions from people in the public, right? People who have no academic training, often they're in Africa, or people of African descent who have familiarity with African names. And that's the whole purpose of the site. And in a lot of ways, what makes this site distinct is that it's not only trying to present to the public information that we culled from the archives, it's trying to engage the public through crowdsourcing. Our basic point is there are thousands of languages represented in these names, and no one can know all of them. Right? So what we need is the kind of on-the-ground knowledge that people bring to these projects where they can see a name if they're from a particular part of Africa and say, oh, that name, not only do I recognize it, but it means this. It has this very specific meaning. And there are some basic ones that everyone knows, day names, names for people born on particular days of the week. But there are really specific ones, like in my context, amongst the Mende. There are names that literally translate to child born with an umbilical cord wrapped around his or her neck or something like that. And we have the option for when people contribute to the site to give those descriptions, which turn out to be kind of mini biographies where you can understand lived experiences. They're small, but over 92,000 names, you can build up a nice profile of these kinds of experiences. So we've had pretty active engagement. We've had contributions to about 35,000 individuals on the site, right? So we've still got more to go, but that's a nice contribution. I, in particular, as a historian of Africa, who's deeply invested in bringing my own work to people in Africa and working with Africans to develop this work, have appreciated, we get lots of emails from people in Africa who will say things like, I saw my own name in this register. I saw my mother's, my father's name. So there's a deep connection to these names in ways that typically, it's one of the first things we learn, right? The slave trade erased people's names and backgrounds. So this is trying to reverse that trend by lifting up this data. It's been the foundation for a growing list of publications for people who have worked on these data. And this began really with David Eltis and Ugo Nwokeji's work on the Cameroons, where they took a few thousand names, identified the likely ethno-linguistic origins of those names, and then wrote up a nice piece on the origins of people caught up in the Cameroon slave trade. I've done this in Sierra Leone. Other people have written articles on the diaspora of Yoruba-speaking people. I have a draft of an essay on the diaspora of Igbo people, which is now like 5 years old and is continuing to be updated. But the possibilities are basically endless because the data is so vast and here. But there are challenges, right? And there are many more challenges than these three, but I see these as three pressing ones. One is, right, this is a database that we are using to write scholarly publications, and yet we're relying on people, often people in Africa who are paying for internet connections by the 15-minute block or the 30-minute block. And there's this question, as there often is with digital projects, how do you acknowledge that kind of work? I was talking with someone yesterday about how digital projects leave open the possibility to better recognize and appreciate scholars who contribute to these kinds of works. It's typically just a footnote in an article, but I think we can do more. But I mean that in both a literal sense on the site for people who make contributions, how do you acknowledge that? But then also in the big picture, what do you do for it? What's their motivation other than just scholarly interest? What keeps people coming back? Along the same lines, right, given that this is a crowdsourcing-based project, how do you keep people coming back? I mean, how do you inspire someone who's an Igbo speaker to go through 46,000 names, which would take years of work? So I think that's another challenge, is continuing to expose to new audiences and inspire old ones to keep using the site. Now I try to engage through email and in ways I can to keep people interested, but that's a challenge. And then there's the basic challenge of this data is complicated. Right? Anyone who's looked at the registers and any historian knows that it's not so easy. It presents easy in the database itself, but how do you do justice to complex data in a website that's not meant to be strictly a scholarly tool? Right? One classic example is that when we first built this site, we had based it on material in the British National Archives. And then it turns out when Paul Lovejoy and his team were digitizing records in Sierra Leone, there are duplicates and in some cases triplicate records of the same name that are spelled slightly differently. It's clearly the same person, but the spelling is slightly off. How do you, right, so you can see here, I hope you can, where you have names that are written side by side, this is that name that appears in different spellings or different ways from one list of registers and individuals to another. Right? How do you present that in a way where someone reading it who's not an academic historian knows just by looking at it? Right? So how do you engage, I guess, the public in a way where this is a user-friendly site, but also do justice to the complexity of the data that underpins it? Okay, I'm 2 seconds over, so I'll stop there. Thank you.
Phil, if you could stay at the podium and take questions and repeat them so that
right.
the folks
Thank
watching
you.
the stream can hear.
Sure. Am I organizing this?
You
or?
can organize it, or if you want me to, I will.
I just hate pointing at people. Yeah. I'd rather you do it.
Question.
When you talk about challenges getting people to engage in contributing to this, have you thought about collaborating with African universities and trying credit-bearing courses for students so that it's not unpaid labour either, which is also problematic?
So the question has to do with recruiting students at African universities to participate in the project and some of the complications that may or may not be involved there.
Right. It's a great question. And yeah, I mean, I did my own research in Freetown, which is sort of the heart of this project, and worked with lots of students, and I think there's real promise. The problem is always a matter of resources. I mean, right now the Origin site has no budget. So until we get a new grant that infuses money into it. And this is, I think, a problem with digital projects in general, is that they're based on these grants, and when you have money, you can do these amazing things. When you run out, you cross your fingers and hope people are still interested. But we have done that in the past and hope to do it in the future, depending on the nature of future funding. Yes?
We were wondering about the first picture that you showed. You didn't say anything about it on the first picture.
Is this one here?
What do you have there, and what time frame is that?
It is the 1860s, if I'm not, or is that right, David?
It's actually
1868. The reason I didn't say anything about it is because this is in fact not from a transatlantic slave ship. It's a powerful photograph and one of the few we have. This is when the British started patrolling the East African coast to suppress the slave trade there. We don't include that data in the African Origin site.
And where
But this is, what's the name of this vessel again? The Daphne, right.
But it's a naval vessel, not a slave ship.
Right, but it was after the British Navy captured a slave ship and then took these enslaved children off of it onto a British naval vessel. Right. Right. So in effect, what happens is after the British ramp up their patrolling of the Atlantic Ocean, they extend that same naval policing into across the East African coast to suppress.
So who are those children? Where do they come from?
Off the coast of East Africa. These were slaves put on Arab dhows off the coast of East Africa.
Mozambique,
Right.
probably.
Right, yeah, Mombasa or Mozambique. There's a number of centers off the East African coast. But I use it only because it probably would speak to West Africa issues just as well. I mean, one of the things you see here is that these are all children. And in fact, in the 19th century, you have this huge spike in the enslavement of children. So I don't think there's anything so striking for the west coast of Africa as this, because we don't have a photograph that makes that same impact.
Gwen.
Okay, I'd like for you to comment on some basic criticisms that some of my colleagues have made about your database.
Sure.
Ibrahim Masek for one, and Carmen Garcia in Cuba for another, has said that you cannot identify names with particular ethnic groups, that they spread all over the place, that people change their names for various reasons.
Sure. I'm familiar
So the
with
question has to do with name changing, and whether or not a name in a record can actually identify somebody from a particular group or a particular place, and whether or not people change their names as they move.
It's a great question, and by the way, nice to finally meet you. I'm familiar with the criticism, which I think it's well taken. I do think that there is the possibility that, given that people who were enslaved in the interior of Africa often spent some time within West Africa and were occasionally, partially integrated into new communities where they might be given new names, right? Right, and on the slave ship as well. What I would say is even identifying the name at that moment in time as a contribution. So I think there's still real value in this, and. I wouldn't imagine, what I would say is it's consistent with the literature, at least on the parts of West Africa that we've written on, with other observations on who was getting pulled into the slave trade. So I think there are ways of checking the data. But we also, one thing I didn't say for the sake of time, we have the options for those names, the first criticism, which is that not all names are specific to particular communities. We have the option to identify names as multi-ethnic and multilingual, and we use that often, right? If we get multiple contributions, even to a name where you can sense an Igbo and a Yoruba person fighting over the origins of a name, we will just eventually label it as multilingual. In other words, you can't say this is specifically to one particular group.
Some of your informants will claim different names for different ethnic.
That's absolutely right. I was just talking earlier about how when I did my research for Sierra Leone, I would get groups of people from different backgrounds in the same room, and in some cases they would fight over the origins of a name. So it's interesting to see in sort of real time how different people claim the name and the arguments they make about why it belongs to particular groups. Right. But in other cases, I mean, in the Sierra Leone case, I can think of all sorts of names that would typically only be given to people from, it's so deeply rooted in one local community. It has
do you make that clear in the database?
In what sense? That
you're not certain that all of the names are clearly identified.
Well, the way that we do that is there's a big box that someone could click to identify something as multilingual and multi-ethnic, right? And this is one of those challenges of the academic versus the public facing dimensions of the site. As there's already too much information in this site. And to give it added context on top of that would, I think, drive some people away, but certainly in the scholarship we produce, we make clear those things.
Okay,
thank you so much.
So I would add that, I mean, you could ask similar questions about ethnonyms that show up in historical documents and whether or not what you can derive from those and whether people might change the ethnic group that they claim.
I'm only asking that you make the problem clear, at least for scholars.
Sure. One more question, anyone? If not, I'll ask a question. So observation that I have is that we have at least 3 projects represented in the room that have that harness the public in order to help with historical analysis. Ed Baptiste and company with Freedom on the Move, this project, and then also our friends from right here with. In the front row who are working with the public on transcribing documents. And I think it would be an interesting conversation to get just about how one goes about doing that. How do we get the public involved, as you've done, as Ed's done, in participation in the project, something certainly more than just using the data that we're presenting, but actually contributing to the analysis of that or contributing to the transcription of that, to the indexing of materials. And so
can I answer that?
There got to be a lot of strategies. No, I throw it out for you. And then,
I mean, the answer is it's hard because short of paying people, which there are not resources to do, and there are ethical questions about that, it's not easy to command people's time. Everybody's busy. What tends to happen, I think, is we go through publicity pushes, which drives up interest in the site. And what I've tried to do, I teach and live in New York, which is extremely diverse. I'll offer to my undergraduate students opportunities to write papers, and then they'll go home and they'll tell their families about it. I was looking for Igbo people who would want to contribute, and then I was in touch with a guy who runs an Igbo newsletter in Connecticut. So it's mostly pounding the pavement and reaching out to people who seem inspired, but often it's just following up. If people are contributing consistently to the site, I'll reach out, I get their email addresses, and I'll reach out and say, hey, thanks, I see you're interested in this. What is it you're doing with it? And they'll say, oh, we came across it just on a Google search. Or the Nyaraland Forum, which was the most recent one, this huge forum of Nigerians that were like millions of people use this thing. And I was just going through it, and I saw a snapshot of the African names dimension of the database. Someone had taken a screenshot and posted it, and there were like 1,000 comments on it. So I posted, hey, have you heard about the Origin site? But mostly it's driven by the people who use the site reaching out. But it's hard. Yeah.
Real quick.
Okay, real quick.
How many names have you guys interpreted so far?
Interpreted in the sense of received feedback on, or that we've... So the process, and I'll see if I don't answer this, I'd be happy to follow up.
Like how many out of the 90,000?
It's about 35,000 individuals, but because the names repeat, it's in fact close to half of the entire database that we have at least one, and in some cases I think we've got 8 different contributions to the same name. So it ranges. It's like the sources for the Voyager site. Sometimes you get one, sometimes you have a full-blown argument, on one name in the database. So we're halfway there, and the trickiest thing is the data that's so vast from what would be Nigeria, because it just takes so long to go through.
Thank you, Phil. Thank you. So while we make the transition here of the microphone, our final speaker on this panel is Susan Rosenfeld from UCLA, and she will be speaking on the Afro-Brazilian Returnee database, the ABRD, New Insights into Freedom and Mobility in the Atlantic World, 1850 to 1900. Like this. And as soon as Susan is mic'd up, we will
Yes.
roll with that.
Thank you.
Thank you to the organizers of this conference. I'm really thrilled to be here at this collaborative effort. As a quick note, I really debated whether to focus on the findings that I've gleaned from this database that I created, or whether to focus on the structure of the database itself. And I decided on the latter, but I'm more than happy to talk about my own findings either in the Q&A or over coffee or whatever. But I do want to begin with a quick short story that comes out of my research. So on the 17th of January, 1854, a freed Brazilian-born girl named Henriqueta de Curoviana went to the police department in Salvador da Bahia to request a passport to emigrate to the African coast. She did so on the orders of her Nago mother, Vitoria, who did not travel with her. Soon after receiving a passport, Henriqueta boarded a ship bound for Lagos with her aunt, and she settled in the burgeoning colony. 5 years later, in 1859, the young girl appeared in a colonial correspondence in which Consul George Brand explained to the Lord Clarendon that Henriqueta's aunt had recently come to him to ask for protection for her niece. Remarkably, Brand's letter recounts Henriqueta's journey from slavery in Salvador to freedom in Lagos. He wrote, "It appears that both the girl and her mother, a native of Yoruba, were the slaves of a Senor José Martins de Curoviana in Bahia. The mother procured her freedom, and sometime afterwards, the freedom of her daughter was purchased by the payment of $300 to Senor Viana. The sister of the mother and the aunt of the girl came and settled at Lagos in the year 1854, and with the consent of her mother, the aunt brought along with her the girl to this place where she still resides." The document goes on to explain that Henriqueta's aunt requested assistance from the colonial government after a series of letters arrived in Lagos. In these letters, the correspondent, claiming to be the girl's mother, asked Consul Brand to surrender Henriqueta's passport and send her back to Brazil. However, Henriqueta's aunt believed, and Brand confirmed, that their former master, Senor Viana, was actually the author. Brand reported, Henriqueta's aunt was asking me to prevent her departure to what would be a second slavery. Consul Brand issued her a British passport as a form of protection. Following this interaction, Henriqueta disappeared from the written record for over a decade. However, on the 14th of June, 1874, almost exactly 20 years to the day from when she initially left Bahia, her teenage children boarded a schooner in Salvador and set sail for Lagos, at the mandate of their mother, whose name is listed on the passport application. It is unclear from the written record whether these children met their mother in Lagos or whether she had returned to Bahia for good. However, the passenger list states that one sibling was born in Africa and the other was born free in Brazil 3 years later, suggesting that Henriqueta maintained both her liberty and her mobility. She traversed the Atlantic, seemingly unafraid of returning to a second slavery in Salvador. The story of Henriqueta and her family, which I pieced together from archival evidence housed on 3 continents, is one of thousands of unique microhistories of formerly enslaved, non-elite Africans and their descendants whose transatlantic voyages between Salvador and the African coast can be traced using the Afro-Brazilian Returnee database. Indeed, the ABRD, which I created as part of my dissertation project, takes into account 3,619 Afro-Brazilian individuals who applied for passports and traveled between Salvador and West Africa between 1850 and 1890. It combines these entries with the 1,176 freed Africans and their descendants who I find in Lagos during the second half of the 19th century. This database originates out of multi-sided research with information collected from manumission letters, passport records, newspaper announcements, marriage and baptismal records, and passenger lists in Salvador, in addition to Foreign Office records from London, local colonial correspondences and newspapers housed in the Nigerian National Archives in Ibadan, and court documents, probate records, and land grant registries from Lagos. Indeed, by cross-referencing the demographic information collated in the ABRD, and connecting it with individual stories of return collected in Lagos, it is possible to piece together fragmentary data to reveal new insights about the patterns of mobility, the relationships, and the histories of non-elite African and African-descended individuals on multiple scalar levels. So I want to give you a screenshot of the database. I made it really small because it has a lot of variables, but this is one portion of the database that accounts for the Africans and Afro-Brazilians who are traveling who left the port of Salvador and went to West Africa between 1850 and 1890. So these people are listed by year. I think this is 1868. And there are various variables that I've taken into account that I'll talk about. So then all of these people are entered into this database, which is an expanded database. And the expanded database includes all the members that were on the previous slide, but then also the Afro-Brazilian members, community members who I find in documents in Lagos. So I took a screenshot to give you an example of how the database merges Africans on both sides of the Atlantic. So you can see, if you look in the space in between the 2 blue lines, this is an example of one grouped entry of a man named Venancio Felipe. So in the database, you can see from various entries that he was a liberated African. He lived in Rio Grande do Sul. And in 1867, he went to the coast of Africa from Salvador with his wife, Felicidade. Another entry shows that in 1876, he sailed back to Bahia on a British passport. And then in 1877, he went back to Lagos. And then in Lagos, the top document in that box is a document from Lagos regarding his estate. So he had written a will in Lagos in 1881, and it named a Felicidade da Conceição as the executrix of the will. And these various things together, along with the dates, tip me off that this is the same person. So So on a macro level, the ABRD is structured around 4,426 African and Afro-Brazilian individuals who traveled between the port of Salvador and the African coast, especially Lagos, during the second half of the 19th century. This large-scale data allows for new estimates regarding the numbers of Africans and Afro-descended people who left Bahia. And it also, the information entered in the database also illuminates changes in demographic and migratory patterns over time. On a meso level, the data contained within the ABRD can be grouped into 14 categories. So in its expanded form, the database includes 84 variables that make it possible to search for various combinations of gender, age, ethnicity, occupation, birthplace, marital status, religion, social status, so enslaved, subordinate, dependent, freed, free, to name a few. The ABRD also contains a subset of variables that trace returnees' social and kinship networks. By assigning numerical values to the relationships between shipmates on return voyages and immigrants residing in Lagos, the database provides new insights into the importance of social ties and kinship relations to Africans' retirement on the continent, as well as their continued Atlantic movement after resettlement. In turn, this data illuminates the enduring relevance of these relationships to returnees' lives in Lagos. It is also important to note that the variables that focus on kinship among immigrants residing in Lagos reveal not only transatlantic relationships, they unveil a large number of regional kinship ties, especially with liberated Africans who came to the colony from Sierra Leone. And this obviously presents new avenues of research and collaboration across databases. The ABRD also incorporates variables that quantify the frequency with which non-elite Africans made multiple voyages between West Africa and Brazil. When these values are aggregated with other variables, so for instance, kinship ties, gender, or occupation, the database provides a more detailed profile of those non-elite Africans who, through their geographical mobility, found alternative spaces of social distinction and agency in the Atlantic world. Finally, the ABRD contains a variable that cross-references individuals who appear in archival documents in both West Africa and Salvador. This variable has allowed me to locate 369 immigrants who I can trace on both sides of the Atlantic. In the local context of Lagos, this data presents multiple possibilities for understanding the various factors that these returnees had in common, revealing their potential motivations for settling in this particular urban node on the West African coast. These 369 immigrants then also illuminate the function of the ABRD on a micro level. As the historical reconstruction of Henriqueta's multi-generational journey exemplifies, these individuals allow scholars to trace particular returnees across multiple locations and documents. In some cases, it is possible to follow their trajectories from birth to death, including their paths from capture in West Africa to enslavement in Brazil, and finally to their self-purchase, emigration from Salvador, and resettlement in Lagos. These microhistories are crucial to understanding how African returnees from Bahia fashioned themselves under burgeoning colonialism, how experiences and memories of enslavement shaped their identities and social networks in Lagos, and how they negotiated and enacted their freed status in Bahia, West Africa, and the larger Atlantic world during the second half of the 19th century. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. Let's have some questions.
Were there people in this community in Lagos who were African born, they came from someplace besides Brazil?
Yes, so there's actually a number, some returnees from Cuba that I find and other scholars have found who come back, and you can find them in sources in Lagos. It's muddy water because there were also cases where people were enslaved in Brazil and then enslaved in Cuba and then ended up back in Lagos. So they're not always mutually exclusive, which again presents issues for how do you categorize them in a database, right?
Bruno.
It's beautiful. I can't wait to see this online to explore your database. Really interesting. And I have two quick questions. I'm curious about why 1850 and not 1835, for example. And the second question is if you have any reference of Muslim Brazilians or Muslim Cubans returning to Hausa
So the question is why 1850 and not some other date like 1835, and then another question about Africans from Cuba, Afro-Cubans and other things. Muslims.
Okay, so to answer your
I can remember one question. Keep that in mind.
So the 1850 was because I was interested for my dissertation on this interaction between people, Yoruba people who had been taken to Brazil, had kind of their experience had been refracted through the lens of slavery in Brazil, and then they go back and it's reflected under this new kind of burgeoning British colonialism, right? And so they're grappling with kind of three factors. There's a lot more data. I mean, this database has a lot of potential to go earlier, to be expanded, to include other points of return in the diaspora. That was just what I did for my own personal research. And then the question about Muslims, there are a lot of Muslim returnees, as you know. I don't see in any of my records them going to like Hausa land. I do see people traveling to Abeokuta, although a lot of that has to do with the Christian population, but also Egba, Yorubas go back to Abeokuta. But no, I don't see them going that far north.
Kristen Mann.
Thank you, Susan. I really appreciate the way in the database you have integrated some of this fragmentary bits of evidence from many different sources on both sides of the Atlantic and indeed from Britain and elsewhere. And I think it's really going to be very helpful in enabling us to better understand the phenomenon that not just is of interest to you, but is a very long-standing interest to scholars. I'd like to ask you to reflect a little bit more on the movement of children in this period, because it was a very widespread phenomenon, and very commonly children were sent back and forth, sometimes in groups. They would spend periods of time in Lagos, and then they would return home. I mean, if you look at the early Catholic school registers, for example, you'll see the priests, and then Johnny had to leave Joaquin had to leave today, he went back to Bahia.
Sure.
So I'm particularly interested in that phenomenon of the circulation of children back and forth across the Atlantic.
Yeah, so in my findings there were a surprising number of children in general. More than I guess I had imagined that there would be. Often it's children who, as you know, are returning with their African-born parents, and they've been born in Brazil. Some of them stay, some of them go for something like schooling and then they go back to Bahia. And some of them kind of start these long transatlantic lives, and you can see them traveling back and forth because they have kin on both sides of the Atlantic. They have transatlantic commercial network that they plug into. Children are a major focus of my database, and one of the things that I'm trying to do is figure out reasons for return for various groups, including children. So one of the things that my database does is it categorizes children in terms of children who went back with their mother, children who went back with their father, children who went back alone, children who went back with the mandate of the Judge of Orphans in Brazil. So all of these different kinds of sub-variables of child travelers. And you and I can talk more about that in terms of numbers, but it's really significant, and it's really important, and it's something that the scholarship's doesn't talk much about is children crossing the Atlantic.
One quick question, and then if you have other questions, you can of course talk during breaks and at lunch. So.
That was fantastic. Thank you. So my question, I guess, is like, do you see from your findings, are there certain factors that allow people to travel more? For instance, I'm wondering like the difference between maybe liberated Africans, like you just mentioned, and those who were illegally enslaved who maybe went to court and got their freedom papers. Like, do some people have more ability to move than others? Is income? Is it certain types of jobs that allow them to collect, amount wealth that then allows them to have more than others? Because I was really also struck that you made the point of saying these were not elite people, right? So I'm just wondering, what are some of the factors that allow them more?
Yeah, so this is something I'm grappling a lot with, and it comes up in a variety of different ways. So in terms of the African-born population, most of them get their freedom through self-purchase, and you see that in all of the manumission records I do have. The vast majority were self-purchased, which suggests a certain amount of ability to accrue capital in Brazil, right? So maybe they're wage earners because they're working in Salvador and it's an urban place. As we all know, they can make money on the side and those types of things. But it manifests in other ways that I'm still grappling with. Like, for instance, these people aren't wealthy and they go back and they become washerwomen and this and that and the other, and they die and they say, I died with, my father died with nothing to his name, right? But at the same time, one of the ways that this manifests is that, when we look at the population of Africans in Salvador, I believe that the statistic is like 20% of them were legally married in a church, right? Most of them had these free unions. And what I'm seeing in terms of marriage patterns of the returnee group is that 89% of them were married legally. So it's this huge discrepancy versus the Brazilian population of Africans. And the question is, that takes money, right? That takes capital. So these people aren't rich, so how are they prioritizing the use of the money that they do have, and what purpose is that serving in terms of transatlantic mobility? So that would be my answer.
Please join me in thanking Susan. So I ask for a quick turnover. If the folks on the next panel could come down and situate yourselves in the front row. We will take a very short break, so don't wander too far. Stretch your legs for a few minutes if you need to.
Il faut trouver les sites. Oui, je vais te laisser.
There's an Apple store, but it's a drop. That would be the best place. Is that right? Do you know any other place that has Apple?